Well, actually, I do read. I'm not able to get through all of the books all of the time, but I have so much good material to draw on that, yes, I read. General MacArthur, who is one of my idols, if you will.
The American Caesar, as a
Yes,
famous book is called.
and he and I are also related, so his ancestors and mine come from the same area in Scotland. And he made it a point always to spend 2 hours a day, even throughout World War II, to read. He would have books available. He had a huge library that he'd inherited from his father, but he always took 2 hours a day to read. And he read history, he read cultural matters, philosophy, law, in order to stay mentally agile. And I think that's what you have to do. If you don't read, you sort of you're living on old intellectual capital, and eventually that wastes away. So yes, I do try to do the same thing. Some days are better than others, obviously, but no matter what, I try to read.
And at the moment, what is for you personally the most interesting book or the most interesting reader who appeals to you the most?
Well, actually, I just received a copy of a book by a German author, a very notable historian. I don't have the book in front of me. If you'd told me ahead of time you're going to ask me these questions, I would have placed it here. And he studied the events leading up to the decision by Hitler to invade the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
And I was trying to understand what was the thought process, what led people to do something that just a couple of years earlier they had all concluded was a serious mistake and should not be done. And I thought that that would be informative regarding some of the thinking that's going on right now in Washington. And you said you talked about an overview. I think Alexis de Tocqueville, who is a French historian,
Mhm.
wrote in 1848, "We are all sleeping at the edge or on the bottom of a volcano."
Mhm.
And I said, I think that's a good description of Washington right now. The difference is that Alexis de Tocqueville understood that, and he was right. That was 1848 before everything began. But the people in Washington don't seem to understand that they are literally sleeping or sleepwalking on the edge of a volcano.
What we see in Europe, I mean, that's my personal impression. And I cannot speak about the whole world. Probably in the United States, there are some similar developments. But my impression of politics, especially in Europe, my impression is that we have some kind of hysterical frenzy. It seems so extreme what happened during the last few years. We had Corona, we had the climate change mania, then we had the entry of the Russians into the Ukraine. Now we have the Middle East, and our politicians seem to be like flipper balls in a flipper machine, jumping from one extreme to the other. I don't know what is your impression of our current times and what could be the root cause of this frenzy, of this mania, of this lack of inner balance and sense of reality, at least according to my perception.
I think the elites, as you call them, I just say the ruling political class, both here and in much of Europe. I say much of Europe because it's very pronounced in Western Europe as opposed to East. Is this political class is largely divorced from its population. That's true here in the United States. I think it's true in Berlin. Certainly, it's true in Paris. Uh, when I say divorced, what I'm saying is that, for instance, they are all talking in Sweden and Finland right now, the governments, that is, about imminent war with Russia. And at the same time, the United States is sending troops, equipment, technology, potentially weapon systems, I don't know, to northern Sweden and northern Finland up near the Arctic Circle, ostensibly for the purpose of quote unquote deterring Russia. Well, and we all know there is no deterrence because the Russians have no interest whatsoever in invading or attacking Scandinavia. And I think the populations are now becoming alarmed because they see the arrival almost immediately, as soon as this NATO business was completed and brought both Finland and Sweden in, of U.S. forces pouring into the country and occupying these remote areas that can only be for one purpose, to position weapon systems and probably intelligence collection with the goal of obviously threatening Russia. And I think the populations are beginning to say, no, wait a minute, we joined NATO, but we didn't necessarily sign on for this. But they didn't seem to understand that part of the agreement was that we be given access to whatever bases we wanted in those countries. This is the sort of thing I think is beginning to happen in Europe. And obviously, I think Chancellor Scholz and President Macron, they're at the end of their respective tethers. In other words, they're close to being removed from power. The populations are discontented now. The populations in France react differently from the way Germans react, but I think they can both agree the governments don't represent their interests. The Germans are struggling very hard to find a new way forward, but it will come to them. The problem in France is they know what the way forward is, and they've just got to get the old leadership out of the way. We have a similar problem here in Washington. We have this supposed election coming in November, but between now and then, people are beginning to figure out, well, this entire economy could collapse. The financial system is already in crisis. And frankly, we could be at war with any number of countries between now and next November, but no one can change that. It's very frustrating.
You are an experienced man. You are also a leader. You have military war experience. You have worked in proximity with high-ranking politicians, not at least the former US President Donald Trump. What is your explanation for this mood of confrontation that our so-called elites are in? Where does it come from that we are stumbling, sleepwalking into these kind of conflicts? Just a little remark. I was at the Vatican the last few days. I talked to many cardinals. I'm a Protestant like you. And they told me, not off the record, it's absolute madness, insanity for Europe to enter into a war with Russia. But where does this headlessness come from, this mood of confrontation? What's your explanation?
Winston Churchill said that success in life consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. I'm not a Churchill fan, and I don't necessarily agree with his definition of success, but I think that's what you're dealing with. The West, collectively, this ruling political class that we're discussing, has moved from failure to failure to failure. And the more they fail, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Iraq. We've retained positions in Iraq as some means of concealing the failure. Our policy of bullying states that don't agree with us has failed. Our policies of sanctioning and bombing people into submission has failed. But the ruling elites know no other way. They know no other way because they are convinced of their infallibility. They're convinced of this globalist ideology, which dictates that the world must be altered and changed or reshaped to suit them. And we all know what their interests are. They want to effectively convert us as peoples into something we are not. That happens through immigration. It happens in our schools. It happens even in the churches. We are supposed to tolerate things that historically we have recognized as fundamentally wrong or evil. All of this has failed, frankly. It is not working. And the less that it works, the more they double down on enforcing their will. And that's what's happening today in Ukraine. That's what's happened in the past. When you take Ukraine, for instance, these people that call themselves Republicans, they're not very different from Democrats, frankly, just put forward a plan that is entitled Plan for Victory in Ukraine. Well, that's a statement of absurdity.
From the Republicans?
Yes. And they are taking a position, which all of the so-called neocons take in both parties, that the failure in Ukraine stems from the fact that we have not provided enough to the Ukrainians. If you look at the vast quantities of equipment, it's not an equipment problem or ammunition, but you don't build armies on the fly. You just don't stand up and say, well, tomorrow we're going to field a brilliant force capable of conquering Russia. That's absurd. Can't be done. It never had any chance of success. But what do you do when you have failed miserably? You don't admit your failure, because if you stand there and say, gosh, I guess we were wrong, all of our assumptions were wrong, then people will say, well, then why are you still in power?
Mm.
So what the elites do, because remember, this ruling class controls the media, the ruling class controls finance, the ruling class controls your governments, the ruling class even controls entertainment in Hollywood. So what do? They double down. In other words, they continue to dig deeper into the hole where they already find themselves. They can't conceive of climbing out of the hole and looking around. Americans in particular have a problem. And when I say Americans, again, I'm talking about the ruling class. Don't connect the ruling class to the broader population. Our population is largely disinterested. It's watching football and following the sex life of Hollywood stars. So most Americans are not engaged. That's a huge problem. It's always been a problem in this country. It has not changed. But the ruling political class is very different. They see the world as something that essentially pays tribute to them. In other words, America to the people in Washington is at the center of the universe. We are the superpower of all time. Therefore, everyone must bow to our will. And our vassal states in Western Europe and the ruling elites in Western Europe are part of that ridiculous set of assumptions. Now, what's happening? Power has been redistributed in the world. We are not the center of the world at all. In fact, I would argue in old Leninist terms that the correlation of forces in the world has shifted decisively against us. And that's not because of anything others did per se. It's largely a consequence of our bullying. People no longer want to do business with us. And it's not just Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. That's all nonsense. There are at least 84 or 85 countries out there. Now, we know the BRICS. Everyone's familiar with the BRICS members. That's a substantial chunk, but there are another 60, 70 nations waiting to join. You have to look at this as resistance to the United States-dominated financial system, which is a burden, not an asset, which seeks to control their commerce, control their economies. They do not wish to be under our control. And as a result, they've also had to build themselves up into something they were never really interested in the past, a serious military alliance. That alliance isn't being signed in some hall of mirrors in Versailles, but it is real. More and more nations are stepping up and saying that's enough. And to this must be added our unconditional support for Israel. Mm-hmm. And whether you like or hate Israel makes no difference. What the Israelis have done in Gaza is criminal. The world knows that. You can talk about it as much as you like in the West and say, oh, no, it's not. You can diminish the extent of the crimes. You can treat the people in Gaza as though they really are animals, which, of course, is the attitude of Mr. Netanyahu and his party, and frankly, most of the Israeli electorate. We cannot do that, but that's what we are doing. We are complicit in it as the United States. And by the way, much of Western Europe is complicit in it. And the West Europeans don't seem to understand there's a difference between what is happening in Israel and what is going on in their own countries, because we know large numbers of West Europeans do not like the fact that they have admitted millions and millions of people from North Africa and the Middle East. Well, of course not. We are allowing millions to flood into our country. It's only a matter of time until that explodes here. But the bottom line is that's separate and distinct from what's happening in Israel, because the Israelis are, in effect, conducting a campaign of mass expulsion and destruction against that population. So all of these contradictions work together to isolate us. And right now, the United States is perhaps more isolated than it has ever been in its history, which is kind of entertaining if you stop and think about it, because people like me that have always opposed these overseas interventions are called isolationists. But we were never interested in isolating the country. We wanted to do business with everyone. Our position was, why are we interfering in the internal affairs of others? But now we really are isolated, and it's only going to get worse from here.
The dark absurdity of unintended consequences. So fascinating what you are laying out here. Public enemy number one of this ruling class in the United States is the former president, Donald Trump. It's amazing. I mean, I would have never thought that he had a realistic chance to come back to the presidency. I talked to some people over the Christmas days, Among them, I don't want to quote them, but some people, from the, you could say, international establishment, these people at these conferences, and they are not totally friends of Donald Trump, but they are saying they think it's quite realistic that he could return to power. How do you see that? And would this ruling class, this powerful establishment in the United States, would they ever let it happen that Donald Trump could ever return to power? Or do we have to face a scenario that Tucker Carlson once explained when he said, well, if they don't can bring him into jail, they will probably try to shoot him. I think that wasn't a joke. I mean, I thought he thought it was seriously. Can Trump return to power?
I think it's a real possibility. Anyone who excludes it is foolish. But let's be frank about something. Donald Trump, RFK Jr., and anybody who is on the left that stands up and eventually becomes a candidate, what do they all have in common? They have all, unfortunately, unconditionally supported Israel. And even Trump has said that if he were president in the future, things such as those things that happened in Ukraine would not happen because he would bully the Russians into submission. In other words, I'm strong, I'm tough, and I can force these people to do what we want, which of course is entirely stupid. Now, to RFK Jr.'s credit, he has not said that. He actually takes the same position that I have over many, many years, that our relations with the Russians should be good. There's no reason why they should not be good. We do not have any vital strategic interests that collide to the point where we should be at war with each other. But having said all of that, there are too many globalists in the camps of all of these candidates. So in that sense, I think the population, the broader electorate, still remains isolated from the candidates. There is no one standing up and saying, wait a minute, we live in a world today where our problems as great powers, France, Germany, the United States, take your pick, wherever you want to go, Great Britain. Our problems are internal. They're not external. There are no existential military threats to the United States. Russia threatens us only because we have threatened them. And if we stopped, it would stop. China, good Lord, anybody who knows anything about Chinese history knows that they're not going to attack anybody. They've got the same problem they've had for centuries. Too many Chinese. They've got to manage it. That's every morning Xi wakes up and he's not worried about us. He's worried about what he needs to do to hold China together. And right now, between the banking system, terrible mistakes in the central planning system, economically, financially, China is in a lot of trouble. No one ever brings it up. Somebody pointed out the other day that Xi had executed the top leadership of the Chinese Navy, or excuse me, rocket forces. Mm-hmm. Well, that's nothing new. I mean, corruption is endemic in that country. It's everywhere. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. But people are looking at you, gosh, I didn't know that. Well, things don't work. Rockets don't work. Ships don't work. Hulls are faulty and flawed. This is Chinese corruption. Anyone who knows anything about China can talk about it. So there's no threat from China. And the Russians would like to get back to normal business. They'd like to get this war over with. We are preventing that from happening. We are stoking the fires, however weak they may be in Ukraine, to keep this going. And we're convincing everybody through our vassal state leaders in Western Europe to keep up this ridiculous front that somehow or another there's war coming from Russia. It's all nonsense. But the danger is the provocations could ultimately provoke the very thing that we don't want, which is war with Russia.
We will enter in these conflict fields in a minute. Just one last political question concerning the United States. I mean, what does it say about the United States that we are about to face a replay of the 2020 election? I'm not against elderly people in politics. Adenauer was quite aged when he became chancellor in Germany. And of course, elderly people can be strong leaders. Ronald Reagan, he was not in his 20s when he was the commander of the American forces and the president. But what does it say about the United States that we seem to have the choice now between Donald Trump and Joe Biden? This is something that preoccupies a lot of Europeans. They think, are there no other alternatives, no other people? What's your take on that?
I would say, I would say, in some respects, we at the moment are a lot like Austria was in the late 19th century. I'm sure some of your viewers will remember Marshal Radetzky.
Sure.
And Radetzky won the Battle of Custoza, was a celebrated hero, and he actually was a very fine field commander, and he was in his 80s. Well, at that point, he should have been retired, but he wasn't. And in fact, as long as he was alive, they kept wheeling him out, almost to the point of put him in a wheelchair and bring him out again to remind everybody that Austria is a great power. It was ridiculous. That's why you have this novel called Radetzky Marsh.
Sure, Joseph Roth, a fantastic novel.
Well, I think there's a great deal of similarity between what is discussed at the end of that novel, the last several chapters, and where the United States is at the moment. Now, we are still far, far more powerful and potent than Austria, there's no doubt about it. But when you look at the gerontocracy that you've mentioned, that's at the top of our political structure, it's a disaster. It all needs to be swept away. We need new blood. But you're not going to get any new blood until there is some sort of upheaval that dislodges these party structures from power once and for all. Because the structures of power in Washington prevent youth, prevent new ideas, prevent people, I would say, of integrity and imagination from ever reaching office. Now, when this happens in a country, you usually get a revolution. That's ultimately what brought Cromwell to power. Mm-hmm. And Cromwell, by the way, was the model for George Washington in the American Revolution. Well, we're at a point in time where people throw up their hands in disgust. However, there's a profound difference. Our economy has not yet collapsed. The financial system is in crisis, but until it tanks, and it will tank, Americans aren't going to pay much attention. In other words, as long as you can afford your one or two cars, as long as you have a house or you have a nice apartment, as long as you can eat, as long as you are relatively satisfied, I'm talking about the majority, nothing will happen. Americans are by nature complacent in this sense. But I would also argue that you can make a similar argument in Germany and in Scandinavia. As long as things are comfortable, people are not likely to do very much. And so you see the money printing, this flooding the markets with more dollars. You see the Federal Reserve buying up our own debt to the point of absurdity. I mean, it's a shell game. And increasingly, fewer and fewer people overseas want to buy our debt, which makes it harder and harder for us to finance the government. So the answer is, when the government cannot finance itself, everything that we have been talking about that is bad will happen to us. Mm-hmm. But until that happens, not much will change.
Don't we see slight symptoms of change? I bring you an example. Harvard University, the president, Ms. Gay, had to leave because of her performance in front of this hearing and because of plagiarism in her scientific work. We see some kind of probably a little downfall of this wokeism in the public sphere. We see in Europe, in Germany now, the protests of the peasants, of the farmers. They're on the streets, they're coming with their tractors, they say, we've had it. The government tries to defame them as right-wing extremists, which even common Germans start to think it's totally over the top, it's totally unjustified. Are these not signs that the so-called ruling class, these establishments, they're somehow falling apart, and sooner or later, democracy, an alternative without revolution will prevail? I'm an optimist, but how do you see it?
Well, I don't agree with your assessment. I don't think things are changing in the way that you imagined. Not yet. If you look at this Harvard president, that woman had no business being president of Harvard University. She had nothing to distinguish her. She was appointed because she was black.
Mm.
That's all.
And a woman.
Yeah, and a woman. But, I mean, the joke, this is 30, 40 years ago, was that if you wanted to be selected as a Rhodes Scholar to go to Oxford in the United States, you needed to be a Spanish-speaking black woman with one leg.
Yeah.
That's been going on for decades. There's a great deal of bitterness inside the United States towards this business of affirmative action. It needs to go away. Anyone who knows anything about Lloyd Austin knows that he had no business being a general officer. It's kind of surprising in retrospect that he was ever commissioned at all. In other words, this is not a Colin Powell who is actually intelligent and articulate and thoughtful. This is quite the opposite. He's no different from the president at Harvard. We have to we have to discard these policies that push people ahead for reasons other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. It's absurd. Just needs to go away. I often point to the basketball, professional basketball. And I always ask people, how many white men do you see on the basketball court in professional basketball? And everybody starts to laugh. Well, you might see one every once in a while, but it's overwhelmingly black. Well, there's a reason for that. They're better.
Mm-hmm.
They are taller, stronger, faster, better. And that's a business. The people that own it want to make money. And so they want the basketball players who are better, faster, and more effective. They don't care whether they're white, black, Asian. It's irrelevant. The fact that they happen to be black is a testimony to their superiority athletically in this setting. All right. Well, most of us think that that same measure should be applied to everything in the United States. Let's put the best people forward. We don't do that. So that's the first thing you have to understand. Until that changes, I don't see anything of significance happening in this country at all. The second part of it, the Germans. You point to the Germans, and I'm a great admirer of German civilization and the German-speaking peoples. But the thing that is troubling is something that Lenin talked about years ago. He said, if I tell the German communists that it's time for a revolution and to come to Berlin and join us, he said, these people will all go to the railroad station and buy tickets on the train, wait for the train to show up and ride the train to Berlin. He said, now, if they were Russians, what would they do? Well, the first thing they do is kill the engineer and take over the train, and then board thousands of people with weapons. And then they'd go to Berlin, take over, shoot at anybody that got in the way. He said, I can never get the Germans to do anything. He said, there will be no revolution in Germany. Well, he was right. That sort of thing wasn't going to happen. And I'm not saying that we're in that kind of situation that requires that kind of action, but the Germans have a long fuse, and it's definitely being lit, if you will, but it's going to burn for a while before it finally explodes. Mm-hmm. And the longer it takes, the worse it will be. And I think that's the truth here in the United States. The longer we wait to finally take action, the worse it will be for all of us. And as I said at the beginning, we're still a long way from this election in November.
A lot can happen. Ukraine, what's the most interesting and important development that we have to diagnose here? What's your actual take now on the situation? Can you bring us your thoughts, your most important conclusions?
Well, first of all, let's pause for a minute and discuss Washington's perspective. Because as Petraeus, who I think is a failed officer in the worst sense of the word, who became a general officer, should never have been a general officer. He's one of these people who's moved from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm.
David Petraeus.
Yes. One of the things that he likes to say is it doesn't matter what happens in Iraq. What matters is what people in Washington think. Understand that Washington lives on an island. We call it Fantasy Island. All right. And on Fantasy Island, Washington, D.C., people in Washington think that the Ukrainian war has been an enormous success story. Now, stop and consider this. They think that we have actually harmed the Russians. They believe that the Russians are incompetent and incapable of doing more than they have. They refuse to see reality. Absolutely out of the question. I'm not sure that if Russian forces marched through Kiev and all the way to the Polish border, that they would ever come to terms with reality. They are absolutely certain that this proxy war against Russia must continue. Now, that's Fantasy Island's view. And all of this without regard to the Ukrainian people, without regard to anyone there, without regard, I would argue, to Europeans in general. They could care less. All of it, as far as they're concerned, could become a war zone if it harms Russia. Hence, you see the stupidity in Finland, the stupidity in Sweden. So what is it in reality? In reality, the Ukrainian nation is probably dead. Millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians have left the country. They will never go back. The birth rate, which was already low, has now gone through the floor. I mean, people are simply not building families, and families are essential to the survival of any civilization and culture. Now we have the Procurator General who finally admitted in public that the Ukrainians have lost 500,000 soldiers on the battlefield. Gosh, what a surprise. What has General Kuyat said? What have I said? What have others said who have any sense of reality? Ukraine is being destroyed. Now, could Ukraine be in worse shape? Of course. The Russians could have gone in and done in Ukraine what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. There's a difference. The Russians don't want to kill Slavic Orthodox Christians like themselves. They never have. By the way, the Russians don't want to kill Europeans. They want to do business with them. So this is not Gaza. All the terrible war crimes attributed to the Russians have not happened. In fact, if there are significant war crimes, they were committed by the Ukrainian forces, and we know who those people are. The sad truth of the matter is, I'm afraid Ukraine is finished as a nation state, but we will continue to pretend that it's something real until it absolutely is not. And the Russian forces are now advancing across the front, albeit slowly and deliberately. But I think even the truth has finally sunk in Moscow that they're not going to find a partner to talk to. And if they can't, they have to go to the Dnieper River and probably cross it and go into Kiev. And that is something that no one on the Russian side wants to do, because Kiev is practically a holy city in the history and culture of Russia. That is the beginning of Orthodox Christianity.
That's the Jerusalem of the Russian culture.
Yes, and so they don't want to fight in that city. And Zelensky could care less about those things. He's shut down Christianity in Ukraine. He's arrested people for it. This man is worse than the NKVD and the Bolsheviks. So they may still have to do that whether they like it or not. But there's no one in the West right now that's going to admit anything. Now, if something were to change in Washington, then I'm sure that many of the vassal states would go along with it. But I still think the so-called vassal European states are going to have change in their own governments. It's up to the Germans, the French, and everybody else to put an end to it. They've got to do it and got to come to terms with reality. But you and I know you're the voice in the wilderness. How many people get to listen to you, Roger? So what are they listening to every night on television? They're listening to lies, nonsense, fantasy.
Well, we have an encouraging growth of viewers, especially in Germany, and I'm, as an eternal optimist, I think that it starts to dawn on people that all these fantasies, all these illusions, all these goals, that they have not been fulfilled. But the question is, if I understand you correctly, you would argue it has to be the European governments who tell the Americans to stop this whole ordeal. Or do you think that in the near future, the United States will put an end to this situation in Ukraine and tell Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, now come to terms with Russia, we cannot longer support you? Is that out of the picture, or could that happen in Washington soon?
I think in Washington, it's an impossibility. You have to have a complete overhaul in that city for anything intelligent and rational to occur. As I said, the so-called Republicans are on the lunatic fringe with the people on the left. They are out of touch with reality. They just published something called Plan for Victory in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's what the Republicans in the House had done. At the same time, and as soon as I heard that, and I was not alone, I said, well, where's the plan to close the border and restore the rule of law, to enforce federal law inside the United States? There's no interest in that because there's no money in it. Biden is not in control of anything. Biden says, signs, whatever he's told to say or sign. So you can forget Biden per se, no matter how convincing he may sound when he speaks. So who's in charge? Is it Blinken? Is it Mayorkas? Is it Merrick Garland over at Justice? Is it Wray in the FBI? Sullivan, the National Security Advisor? There are lots of people that wield power behind the scenes, and of course, they're responding to donors, people with billions of dollars who want certain things to happen. They want the war in Ukraine to continue. They want war in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. And they think in doing so that they are going to make Israel more secure and more survivable, when I think it's going to have the opposite effect. That's where we are. And until the people that are there are removed and sent away, and we bring in fresh blood, fresh leadership with fresh eyes, I don't expect Washington to change. So that means Europe has to do something. Now, everyone looks at me as soon as I say that and say, oh, come on, Douglas, you know NATO and EU, these people won't do anything. Well, we'll see. Like you, I'm somewhat more optimistic. I think in Europe, things could change sooner than they will here.
I talked to a taxi driver recently in Berlin, and we talked about the United States. And of course, in Germany, they're always a bit careful what they're saying, to a stranger. But somehow we got along quite well. And I asked him, "What do you think about Donald Trump? What is your perspective?" And then he said to me, an intelligent man, taxi driver, he said, "Well, to me, Donald Trump is the last hope of civilization. He would end these stupid wars. That was his promise at the time." What are you saying? Would you say that Donald Trump would stop these wars? And talking about Russia, how big could the influence, the impact of Donald Trump be on Vladimir Putin? They always said they got along quite well. They respected each other. Could Trump bring Putin into a position to find a new partnership with the West?
International relations have nothing to do with personalities. It's always nice when one person can agree with another, but international relations is ultimately about interests, hard interests. When in 1938, Stalin and Hitler decided to sign the so-called non-aggression pact, which resulted in the dissolution of Poland, why did that happen? It happened because they shared interests, not because they liked each other. They both hated each other. The notion that Donald Trump will come in and instantly change anything, I think, is something we need to re-examine. First of all, the last time it didn't work very well. We spent 4 years while tragically he floundered. The question is, has he changed? Will he bring in completely new people? Or are we simply going to see more retreads? In other words, individuals who are part of the problem, part of the Washington swamp, people who already have 1 foot on Fantasy Island. Fantasy Island is poisonous. You've got to get rid of it. So you've got to bring in new people. The second thing is, has he finally discovered the enormous power at his disposal? I don't know. I mean, right now, the presidency seems to be almost irrelevant. Congress, the Senate, and the House have enormous power because there is no one in the White House. What's happened, though, is that the people behind the scenes, some of whose names I mentioned, are in agreement with people on Fantasy Island that are in the Congress, that is the Senate and the House. So can he go in there and can he make profound change? What has he learned? And I'm not yet sure that he's learned the lessons he needs to. And the other thing is that I'm, as an English-speaking person, I don't like the idea of people looking for saviors. I hear people say, "Oh, he'll save us if he gets in here." I hate that sort of thing. To my core, I like to think in larger terms, and I always believed in the Republic. So I'm disenchanted with the savior or this messianic complex that Americans are looking for someone to step in and save them. It's bad. I don't like it. It doesn't appeal to me. And so I have serious doubts about that. But then again, we'll have to see. I just don't know. And I look at the others, there are no saviors out there.
About many destroyers. Let's talk about Israel. There are rumors, there are talks that from this regional war in Gaza and in Israel, there could emerge a larger war. How dangerous is the situation in the Middle East right now?
It's extremely dangerous, but it will not explode instantly into a regional war. The people that go back and look at events in late July, early August of 1914 and see parallels are not wrong. But the difference is that the various great powers are moving cautiously, very cautiously, because the only ones in the region interested in going to war are Israel and the United States. Now, you could include the United Kingdom with its Lilliputian Navy and its Lilliputian Army and its Lilliputian Air Force. Those things are almost negligible, but they're probably the single most loyal vassal state in the world to us, not because their population wants it, but that's the nature of the globalist elite in London. But we're not prepared for any of it. Neither is Israel. And I think that there's a tendency to discount the region. People have difficulty understanding just how much has changed in the region. They think that this is still 1973, when the Israelis made a similar error and they were surprised, and then they rebounded with lots of help from us. This time it's different. Why is it different? Because the populations in the region are much better educated. The populations in the region can pick up this, just like you and I, and they can turn it on and they can watch what's happening on the ground in Gaza. The populations in the region are enraged. They do want action against Israel. The problem is that the leaders in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Jordan and Egypt know that their countries are fragile. Their societies are fragile. They don't want to sustain extensive infrastructure damage, but they may not have much choice. So what we see happening right now is a little different from 1914. We just launched strikes into Yemen against the so-called the Houthis, these Shiite tribesmen in Yemen, who are incredibly tough people. I mean, you have to keep in mind that they've been bombed and harmed by us and the Saudis for years, until finally there was some shred of humanity in the United States and people recognized this shouldn't go on. They launched some strikes. What did we do with these strikes? Well, the first thing we did is inform the Houthis that we were striking them. Isn't that interesting? We told them we're coming. We may have told them roughly where we're coming. We seem to have picked targets that we've struck before. Now, I haven't seen a detailed target list. I don't know in great detail, but if you look at the map and you look at the things that they've destroyed and you compare it with what we've attacked previously, it looks a lot alike. In other words, it's difficult to believe that we found something new. And I've been through this before during the Kosovo Air Campaign. People bombed and bombed and bombed, and they ran out of targets. And so what did we do? Well, we went back and hit those targets again. What do you do when the bombing campaign doesn't work? And ultimately, that bombing campaign failed. It was our bribing of Yeltsin and his government to support us that persuaded Milosevic to stop, because the Russians called him and said, we can't supply you over the winter. We can't provide you with what you need. You're going to have to throw in the towel because we can't do what we promised. And so I don't know how many billions of dollars Strobe Talbot promised them on behalf of Clinton. I don't know the details. Nobody really does. But Yeltsin and his government said, fine, we'll throw Milosevic and the Serbs under the bus. Mm-hmm. The rest is history. This time, we're doing some of the same things. So how much impact will this have on the Houthis? I don't think it's going to have much impact. Now, then that means the Houthis go back to launching drones and missiles at whatever commercial vessel decides to penetrate the Gate of Tears and move into the Red Sea. And then as soon as they do, even if we shoot the stuff down, that's enough to stop everything. Because right now, the insurance companies have effectively said the whole area is a war zone. This is certainly true for Mr. Netanyahu. Now, as far as the atrocities on 7 October are concerned, and there were some, as time has passed, we see a lot of people debunking many of the claims that were made originally. Now, I haven't studied that in detail, and I'm not suggesting that that exonerates Hamas. Hamas went in and did terrible things. I do subscribe to the view that Hamas did what you would expect people to do who emerged suddenly from years and years and years of deprivation and oppression would do. So that's true. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, I think the Israelis made some assumptions about the Hamas fighters, their enemy in the region, that were untrue. They were unsound. I think they thought these were like many of the Arab forces they fought in the past that have struck hard and resolutely on the ground and in the air would crumble. They haven't crumbled. Now, the Israelis claim to have killed 8,000 Hamas fighters. How do we know? Have we seen 8,000 dead Hamas corpses? Have we seen, tangible, concrete evidence for that? No. We do have evidence for almost 23,000 people being killed in Gaza, but overwhelmingly they look like women, children, and old men. So I don't know how to assess that. The Israelis sent forces in that were reserve forces. As I think I may have mentioned to you, I certainly have before, my IDF contacts told me early on they were very concerned about these reservists because they had far, far less training and experience under their belts than the reservists of 1973. And then secondly, without very much experience, they were and training, they were being sent into the worst possible environment. Urban warfare is terrible. And whenever you can avoid it in military affairs, you want to avoid it. And there were many Israeli generals that pointed these things out too, who are retired and said, we understand we need to strike back. We understand the requirement for a counterstrike, but going in great numbers into this urban area, particularly after you've destroyed it. And once again, the lessons from World War II are very clear. If you destroy the city, it's much easier to defend than if you leave it largely intact and then go after the enemy. All of those things were ignored. And I think as a result, the Israelis have taken far, far higher casualties than they are willing to admit. And you can read in Haaretz, who's talked about anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 casualties on the Israeli side. And I've seen numbers as high as 800 dead, but I have no way of knowing any of it. And there's no way to get at the truth, none whatsoever. So the only thing that we can assume, because they pulled out large numbers of troops who were in there, organizations that had been decimated, frankly, and worn out and exhausted, that they had to change forces, rotate forces, rest up forces, because now they're very focused on Hezbollah. So they failed. Gaza is not won by no means. And they may have decided, well, for the moment, we've done as much damage as we can do. We can return to that later. Now we need to focus elsewhere because the West Bank has become very, very explosive. And then you have another 1 million plus Palestinians in Jordan who want to arm up and go across and help their Arab brothers who are also Palestinians fight back against the occupation in the West Bank. This whole thing has been a disaster, in my judgment, strategically for Israel. But there is never, just as we refuse to consider the possibility of talking to people before we act, the Israelis have taken the same approach with the Arabs, believing in their hearts that the only thing that their Arab opponents will understand is force. We take the same position. We refuse to talk to the Russians. We refuse to talk to the Chinese unless they get on their knees and worship at the altar of globalism and the American-dominated financial system. Then they can't possibly be partners for us. It's sheer insanity. It has no future. It's almost as bad as FDR's unconditional surrender demand of the Germans and the Japanese. What it guarantees is more bloody warfare.
What do you think will be the impact of this indictment by South Africa, where the president talks about genocide in Gaza? I mean, this is a rather a rare case that Israel is in this way attacked in the International Criminal Court in Den Haag. What will be the impact of this South African initiative?
Inside the United States, none. No impact at all. We're not signatories to the arrangements of the International Court of Justice, so we're not going to pay any attention to it. You're a better judge than I am of how many people in Europe will pay attention. And will the media in Europe actually report on it in any detail? I don't know. But here, there will be no impact at all. Certainly none on the Hill, because once again, all of these people are part of the network that has been built up for many years by the Israelis themselves and their agents here in the United States. So I don't see any impact.
Over the Christmas days, I read the book by the British historian Tom Holland called Dominion, which is the history of Christendom since the beginnings in antiquity. And he brings up a very interesting example in the year of 634, after the birth of Christ, that the Arabs, the Muslims, were entering Jerusalem, conquering Jerusalem, telling to the Jews, "You have failed as God's chosen people. That's why the Romans took your empire away, destroyed your temples, and now it's our turn. We will be in Jerusalem, the ruling power. We build on the holy sites of your palaces and your temples. We're building our temple." And when I read this or heard this episode, I thought, can there ever be peace in the Middle East? I mean, if you have two sides who say, this is our holy ground, and we are both equally entitled to reap our claim here, there will never be a peace. I mean, you are an observer of the situation in the Middle East since many, many years. You look at it also from a military perspective. What's your opinion here? Can there ever be peace between Israel and the Arab world, or is that an internal biblical struggle never going to end?
Well, a lot of things that seem to be religious in character are often not purely religious, but cultural, racial, and also involve political interests. So I'm not sure I would see everything through the biblical lens. Don't think that's necessarily a good answer. There is evidence that there could be, or at least there was. And I always point to the outcome of the 73 war, particularly with Egypt. And that produced a treaty in recognition of Israel that was very important. And that was between Sadat and Begin. Those two men came together, and ultimately we got the arrangements that have produced peace on the Egyptian border now for decades. The problem is that too now is at risk because Mr. Netanyahu has talked about the Philadelphia corridor. This is the border between Gaza and Sinai, which is in Egyptian hands, and said that the Egyptians are not adequately securing it. It's a sieve. In other words, too much is getting into or coming out of Gaza, and therefore we Israelis are going to take it over. Well, if the Israelis decide to do that, that could result in an immediate declaration of war by Egypt against Israel. So I hope that doesn't happen. So there is some evidence that you can forge peace. Now, why hasn't it happened elsewhere? Well, we could spend hours discussing that. But right now, given what has happened in Gaza, I don't think there's much chance of any reconciliation. Now, could there be in the future? Perhaps. But I would tell you that what's happened in Gaza has awakened a new spirit in the region. There's this concept from an ancient Arab, well, I shouldn't say ancient, from the 13th century and 14th century, an Arab historian. And he talked about the concept of Asaviyah. Asaviyah was a discussion point about the cohesion of the Muslim world. Remember, he lived in a world where he could travel from southern Spain all the way to modern day Stalingrad, which was near the capital of the Tartars. And he was entirely in a Muslim environment. Islam stretched across the Middle East, across India, across North Africa, all the way into Spain and back into what today we call southern Russia. And he talked about the fact that people do not understand Islam until they have seen the power of Islam. Now, remember, in the 13th century, Islam was still a very potent force, not just in religious terms, but also militarily and economically.
And scientifically, I mean, they
Yeah, of
conserved all
course.
the ancient writings of Aristotle and all the philosophers, bringing it back to Europe somehow.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And the Jews played a role in that too, within the framework of the Islamic world. Very few people ever talk about that. I mean, the doctor who treated Salahuddin and advised him was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a role for them in that part of the world. That later on there were problems, but the point is that that was a different world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not suggesting that today they would all automatically or instantly rise up as one, but people that I know very, very well who are not Americans per se, some are, one or two were, they have traveled within the last 4 weeks to every major capital in the region, including Tehran and Ankara. And they have told me repeatedly that what they hear in Cairo, what they hear in Riyadh, what they hear in Ankara is the same thing. And that is Sykes-Picot is over.
Mm-hmm.
It's finished. In other words, what brought Israel to life is no longer going to be honored any longer. That's very important. And the second thing is that even those who have serious disputes with each other, when I say serious, most of it's territory or people, particularly the Turks and the Iranians, or even disputes over territory in the Arabian Sea between the Iranians and the Arabs and so forth. These things are being suppressed in favor of recognizing the criticality of unifying against Israel and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's only a matter of time until we see, I think, the massive embargo on oil and gas begin to take its toll on us, on Israel, and on Europe, I would suspect, over time. The Chinese are very upset about it because they are very dependent on what comes out of the Persian Gulf. They are also dependent on the food that comes out of Africa to reach China and feed 1 billion people. My point again about Xi is that Xi is the last person that wants a war. But depending upon how these events develop over the next few months, he may feel obligated on behalf of his country to intervene in some way to support those who promise to end this stupidity. And that's not us. And it certainly isn't Israel. Israel wants, in the form, not just because of Mr. Netanyahu, and this is important to point out, Netanyahu may go. This war will not end. What the Israeli population wants is a showdown. And they want us to be part of that showdown because they know otherwise they can't win it. So I think once you begin going after the Houthis, it won't work. And so then someone's going to step up and say, well, we're going to have to send in ground forces. And, my British friends who served in Aden all shake their heads and say, the last thing you want to do is chase these people through the mountains of Yemen. Very unrewarding operation. But I don't see how we avoid that, given the probability that these bombings are not going to change a great deal down in Yemen. I think the Israelis, rightly, by the way, see Hezbollah as far more dangerous and potent than Hamas. And I think they'll want a war of annihilation against Hezbollah, which is why, of course, we had a carrier battle group up there in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm sure we'll see another one arrive at some point in the near future to augment and reinforce Israeli operations against Hezbollah. At some point, this brings in Iran.
Mm.
And the Turks and the Iranians and virtually dozens of countries in the Middle East and Africa, they've all signed on, and so has China, for this court case in the International Court of Justice. Mm-hmm. There's no question in anybody's mind about who is responsible for these horrible atrocities and who has to be prosecuted. So again, we're very isolated. We have our, Lilliputian friend in the United Kingdom, sailing along behind us in a little dinghy. And then you have the Israelis, who are playing the role of Serbia in 1914, urging the great empire to intervene on their behalf and crush their enemies. It didn't work very well for the Serbs. And this time around, I don't think it'll work well for the Israelis. My greatest concern, and I've always supported Israel, I've always felt that it's a state that should exist for a whole range of reasons. And as a state, it could be a very positive and productive member of the international community. But it may not survive. I think that's a real possibility. Today, no one can conceive of that. But we're in a slow progression down the sort of side of the hill. I always tell people that I see the United States government much like a runaway locomotive. It's headed down the side of a mountain, but it's a mountain in Switzerland, and it takes time to get down that mountain, but they're headed down and they don't have any brakes. Now, there is a brake that's possible. It's called financial ruin. That could operate as a brake on this. But unless that happens between now and April, I think by April we will be involved in a regional war that sadly has the capacity to become global. I mean, the Russians are not fools. They're watching what we're doing in Sweden and Finland. You know, they listen to these maniacs in Lithuania and Poland. They're worried. I would be if I were a Russian. So they know that we're not suddenly going to have a come to Jesus moment and figure out that there is no threat from Russia and there's no reason for war with Russia. They have to bet on the alternative. Russia will not stand by and allow us to bomb Iran into the Stone Age. They won't permit it. And then there are the Turks. And Erdogan is nothing if not careful, but his population is far more engaged in this and far more enraged than the population in Iran. I would say that at least 50% of the Iranians could care less what happens in the Middle East. That's not true in Turkey. And they will eventually be drawn in. As Erdogan himself has said, the time will come when Turkish soldiers fight in Gaza. I think it's all going to come together this year. And I'm predicting April timeframe, maybe May, but I think it'll take the next several months for this to coalesce and build up. So it is not like 1914, where you could instantaneously trigger de facto existing alliances, because the difference is that the people in the region, their leaders, don't want war, but they will fight. But they'll have to be slowly drawn in the way we are being drawn in, and then it will blow up in our faces. Then the question is, how much larger does it get? Does it become global? Do the Chinese finally step in behind the Russians and decide that they too have to engage? I don't know. But we should not dismiss any of these possibilities. War is something that once you set it in motion, you have very little control over where it goes and what it does, which is why, in most cases, you don't want it. You know, and I always go back to Bismarck. Bismarck always understood that if you're going to have a war, you want to think carefully about ending it as quickly as possible. And you want to end it in a way that everyone can live with the outcome. There's no one thinking about that in Washington at all, and certainly nobody in Western Europe that I can find.
I'm desperately struggling to find the silver lining in this very dark picture at the moment. And this is really an intellectual challenge. But I have to quote Tolstoy in this moment in War and Peace, in this fascinating last book, where he describes the rise and fall of Napoleon. And Tolstoy says, it's not the leaders and it's not the stupidity of the war leaders that are actually influencing the course of politics, but it's the will of the people. And if I take Tolstoy literally, I would say the silver lining, the beam of hope could be that the peoples on this earth, they don't want a huge confrontation. The Europeans don't want war. The Chinese don't want war. The Russians don't want war. I mean, the Americans, they are safe behind two oceans. These wars do not affect them as directly as they do, for example, Europe. Don't you think that the collective will for peace of mankind will somehow, I don't know how, bring a development in motion that finally this whole insanity comes to a stop Or let's put it even more concrete, isn't there a chance that the Americans would say to the Israelis, now it's enough, stop it? Could at least the Americans stop Israel?
No, I don't see that happening, not at this time. I'd be very surprised if anyone stepped forward with that view. And remember, we talk about the will of the people. It's not the will here, it's the absence of will.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, the population is not engaged.
And it's the dynamics of events.
Yes. And, look, if you go back to the 1930s, go right through 1939 and 40, look at the polling data. No one in the United States wanted another war in Europe. The only way we got a war in Europe was that Hitler foolishly, over the objections of his general staff, declared war on the United States, ostensibly because he was obligated under the treaty with the Japanese. And the general staff said, don't do this. And he said, well, the Americans are already in it anyway. Well, we know that they're supplying our opponents. That's true. But let's not give them an excuse to throw their full weight into the fight. Don't do this. Don't declare war. If anything, you can refuse to do so despite the treaty. And if the Japanese don't like it, that's fine. But they're a long way from us and can't help us or hurt us. Mm. That was good advice. He didn't take it. I don't know what will happen here. But again, as I pointed out, most Americans are not engaged. And you said it very well. We're safe behind our oceans. Americans need to be educated. The oceans now are an illusion. There are Russian submarines right off the coast of the United States who have the capability to destroy most of our cities. We need to wake up and understand that that world we think we are in doesn't exist. And so I think Americans have to be hurt in some way. And I think the most probable way out of this disaster is for things to collapse financially and economically here. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me that the biggest supporters for the wars overseas and the interventions are also simultaneously dismissing the problems that we have financially and economically. They're treating the $34 trillion national sovereign debt with complete disinterest. They're ignoring the bond market. They're ignoring everything, frankly. They point, well, look, the stocks are going up again. Great. See, everything's fine. Stock market is not a barometer for the United States and its economy. It never has been. But this is the problem. We're too remote from it. So I think Tolstoy isn't wrong, but he's looking at it in a way that we can't see it today. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, was not a very impressive man. He was impulsive, emotional, and childish on numerous occasions, as Metternich points out. But Alexander I actually cared about Russia. Who really cares about the American people?
I mean, do you think that the fact that we have these two wars now in the Middle East and still in the Ukraine, that's a symptom of the weakness of the United States? I sometimes think if we had a stronger presidency in the United States, we would have had more order on this planet. Or is this a too romantic view of Washington?
Well, keep in mind that globalism, which aspires to global governance, is inherently anti-democratic. Mm. Everything the EU wants to impose regarding vaccinations, immigration, rights, whatever, all of it is anti-democratic. The peoples of Europe have not been consulted directly on most of these issues. No one in the United States is being consulted on anything. If you had consulted the American people on immigration, that would have ended 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. They were never consulted. If you had asked the American people about what to do in Iraq in 2003 after Afghanistan, I don't think the majority of people would have voted for the invasion. So the problem is the people in power are anti-democratic, and they are convinced that they are making decisions that are good for us. In other words, they have achieved what Marx and Lenin called the monopoly on truth. They know more than we do. We need to be obedient peasants, get in line and march forward under their leadership. I hope the Europeans will wake up first, but the Americans, again, I think the Romans used to refer to this as bread and circuses. We are drunk on bread and circuses. And as long as we are focused on bread and circuses, where the legions are, where war is waged, makes no difference to us. Oh, of course, we have a problem they did not have. Our legions are falling apart because nobody wants to join them. And you have a huge issue there with the quality of people joining them. But no one talks about that because, again, Fantasy Island says it's still 1991 when we were a different nation and we had different forces. It is not 1991. But Fantasy Island hasn't caught up. And I just don't think it'll catch up. Only a tidal wave that comes out of nowhere and sweeps Fantasy Island and rids it of these people can save us.
So that would be, I mean, in my understanding, your appeal, I mean, I take it from your rather gloomy analysis, the appeal is that somehow the peoples, the democratic sovereign, we, the people, we have to topple these governments, find new people, and then they have to work towards peace. Because if we let that just slide on, we are in a situation that gets worse from day to day, and we'll probably end up in a regional or even in a larger than regional big war where you have a real confrontation, a military confrontation between all these powers you have just mentioned.
Yes, I think so. And in a different world, if this were the age of Dwight Eisenhower or Richard Nixon, I think people would say, well, this solution is obvious. Stop the Israelis from bombing Gaza. Pick up the phone calls, stop now, because they would be able to see that it's like looking at an edifice, a wall, an arch, and the stones are falling out. The national security environment is collapsing. So what do? You stop what you're doing because the world doesn't really want to go to war, or shouldn't, and it's not going to satisfy Israel. But Israel is in a precarious position. It too needs to think about its own survival. It should not overextend itself and overreach and assume that it can leverage us indefinitely. But that is the view right now. And to be frank, there's a lot of evidence that they are right. But as you say, at some point, people will be horrified and shocked. But when is that going to happen? That's why I'm betting on the financial economic dimensions more heavily than I am expecting any sort of rationality to visit Fantasy Island.
One thing that I think is, in my eyes, a root cause of this mess is the loss of religion. I'm not a very religious man, but I think that the loss of religion, the loss of tradition, the loss of the roots, and the loss also of the humility is a root cause of this, this megalomania that we see in political governments. These people think they are the measure of all things. They think they can succeed, whatever the cost. And there is a total lack of humility. And I think this lack of humility has something to do with the fact that we don't have religion anymore. The people are running after pseudo gods. They think they are gods themselves. Do you think that the lack of religion, the lack of tradition of our roots is somehow one of the deeper causes of all these problems we're talking about?
I certainly think it plays a role. I would go a bit further. And again, Europeans understand this, Americans do not. But if you look at the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which everybody says was neither holy nor Roman, that may be true, but that was the largest construct. Then you had Polish Lithuania in the east, then you had France and Britain in the west. But in those times, in the Middle Ages, in the aftermath of the Roman Empire, you had three important institutions that were the foundation of European civilization. One was the church, one was the crown, and the other was the army. World War I tended to destroy those three. World War II almost finished them off completely. Have we ever really replaced those as the foundation for our identity, our purpose in the world? Don't think we have. I mean, whenever I visited Vienna, my friends in Vienna would say, "Well, welcome to the museum." And I would say, "What are you talking about?" "Well, this whole country is a museum. Who are we? Without what we were, we are what? Are we an extension of the German nation, or are we something else?" And nobody's completely sure. The Germans were deprived of all three of those things for all intents and purposes. I don't think the Germans have ever recovered. The French would say something similar. The Poles think so privately as well. And I'm not saying everyone needs to become a fundamentalist and get on his knees or her knees and adopt whatever. That's not the point. The institutional framework is not there. And our institutional framework is breaking down. Our republic was something we regarded as inviolable. And we were very convinced after the Civil War that between the Constitution and, most importantly, the Bill of Rights, that we were in a very good shape. But we always forgot something. The institution is always a measure of the man who controls it and leads it. We've run out of good men, I would argue, for all intents and purposes. And this is something that Lord Macaulay, a British historian, warned us at the time. He said, things will be great in the United States as long as they continue to find good men to run it, to populate it, and as long as the population is engaged. But our problem is now very different. Remember, our structure was designed in the 1780s for a nation of a few million people, all of whom spoke English, most of whom were white and Protestant. Today, what are we? And the other question is, well, today is a very different country. Who are we? And does this 18th century concept of government really make any sense? But I tell people over and over and over again, the thing we must cling to desperately is our Bill of Rights. That is the centerpiece. When that cracks, and we've seen a lot of evidence right now for the weaponization of government against our citizenry, that's falling apart. Now, it hasn't fallen completely apart, but it's at great risk. The Bill of Rights can carry us through many things if we can enforce it. But to enforce it, you have to have the rule of law. And that rule of law, which used to be the hallmark of this country, is definitely in trouble.
Yeah, and this is a phenomenon we see also in Europe. I mean, you see these news that in Poland, the new government is taking into prison former ministers. They're arresting them even in the presidential palace. You have, news like this, or you see in Germany where the government institutions start to criminalize the opposition. Everybody who is against the government is called a right-wing extremist, a Nazi, and probably they can be arrested too. I mean, one can argue this is a very dark situation. On the other hand, it can also be read as a symptom of desperation. It shows somehow that these political governments, they're really at the end of their Latin, they are at the end of their song, and the only instrument they have left is to use their power to start to close down the opposition, to fight them. I mean, it's not. It's actually a symptom of weakness.
Oh, I think you're right. I think that's absolutely true. I would compare the current environment as a sort of a slower but nevertheless effective emergence of Bolshevism in the West.
Totalitarian, kind of a soft totalitarian approach.
Yes, yeah, but these people are very much like the Bolsheviks. In this country, we have them who will openly tell you that their inspiration is Trotsky, who, of course, thought of himself as a more humane version of Bolshevism, although he nearly killed millions of people as well. This is what you're talking about, because if you look carefully at the agenda, drop the age of consent for sex with people to 12. I mean, that's being discussed. It's insane, incomprehensible. It's the complete overthrow of what you referred to earlier as any morals at all in the absence of any notion of Christianity. In fact, Christianity is increasingly treated as the enemy, the source of all evil. And of course, that was the Bolshevik motto. Trotsky ran all over the country in 1919 and 20, destroying not only churches, but synagogues. He destroyed everything in the effort to build this new socialist utopia. We have something similar happening without all of the violence, without the NKVD. But what happened? Ultimately, it all failed. No one wanted it. So you open concentration camps. They called them the Gulag. Mm-hmm. And then you start putting millions of people in there because your ideology doesn't work. Well, this ideology doesn't work. The good news is that we are not prostrate as Russia was in 1917-18. Mm-hmm. That's not where we are. There is enough of us left that we can stop this. Mm-hmm. And I think it can happen in Europe, and I think it can happen here, that we stop it. Mm-hmm. But the problem is when? How long do you wait?
And what do you
trigger?
And what do you suggest should conservatives do to stop the terror of the left? What do you suggest to conservatives who feel, sidelined, threatened, accused of being right-wing extremists? What's the best way to counter these totalitarian leftist defamations?
Solzhenitsyn once addressed his comments to the Politburo in Russia, and he pointed out at the beginning of them, I know there are sons of Russia in this government who believe in Russia. Where are you? Step forward. And then he went through the rest of his remarks, which were, as you know, very similar to what we're discussing today. Mm-hmm. I think the question has to be, where are the sons of Germany? Where are the sons of France? We all already see people in the French military, God bless them, who describe themselves as soldiers of France. We will not let this anarchy continue. Well, we need a similar movement, but we need action. In other words, appeal to them as what they really are, not as, Weltbürger, this sort of nonsense. I'm a world citizen. That's all crap. What are you? You're a German, you're Swiss, you're Spanish, you're French. When are you going to step forward and defend what you really are, your country and what it stands for, the institutions that make it up? And that's what I talk about frequently. Where are the Americans? I'm tired of all these people that want to be something else and then American, or want to be a dual citizen or something. That all needs to go away. Either you are an American or you are not. And what is an American? Answer that question. When those questions are answered where you are, I think you will begin to get change, and you will realize these governments in Europe are fundamentally opposed to their own country, their country's history, its culture, its way of life, its people. They want to dissolve it. They want to do away with it. Somehow or another, in their deranged minds, they think this is good for the world. One of the things that we used to say when I was on active duty, we thought we were in Europe because we thought we were defending European civilization. We used to say, if water is purest at its source, then this place called Europe is the fountainhead of our civilization. And that, of course, is when we thought, as Americans, that we too were part of this civilization. Of course, my French friends used to say, Douglas, no one thinks America is really part of Western civilization. And I would laugh. But the point is, that's where you've got to go, And if Europe goes there, we'll be fine. You'll come through it. Because the people that are concerned about their countries, they're overwhelmingly democratic in their orientations. These people are not interested in a messiah to save them. They're interested in countries that work, societies that are effective, that produce things. That's what they want. So I absolutely oppose these people that say, oh, well, you're talking about something that could become fascism. Fascism emerges when countries are fragmented internally, and the majority of the people that are inside the country are at risk. They feel that they could be destroyed. Fascism is about unity. Now, that's why you got fascism in the 30s. It wasn't an accident. And people knew what was going on inside the Soviet Union, and they were afraid of it. Well, there is no Soviet Union. Russia poses no threat. That's not the problem. The problem is at home. The people that are most threatening to the futures of their country are the people that are in their governments. Isn't that awful?
It's awful, but at the same time, what a fantastic end note of this conversation. Your appeal to the sons of Switzerland, the sons of France, the sons of Germany. And I am deeply convinced that exactly this will happen, because I think human beings are constructed in a way to survive. And after terrible errors, somehow the light of enlightenment will touch them. The question is when. Colonel Macgregor, many thanks for this again so illuminating conversation. It's always a great pleasure talking to you, spanning all these fields and these territories. Thank you very much. All the best, and let's hope for the sons of the United States, of France, and of Germany.
Thank you, Roger.